guys, Otterpop here, and welcome to a new Dan vs. review. So this is going to be the review for Season 1, Episode 7, Dan vs. Traffic. I'm going to remember it this time. Don't forget, the link to the actual reaction is going to be down in the description below, but this is the review, which starts off with a very quick recap of the episode. So for this particular episode, traffic jams of all kinds cause Dan to go to the bathroom in his own car, so he vows revenge on traffic. I didn't foresee this one working out well. So first off, I was already noticing that, or I was rather beginning to appreciate the title card variation. Like, it was obvious that, you know, they were all different based on the different sort of revenge schemes that Dan would take revenge on. That makes no sense, but I still stand by what I said. But it started to make me appreciate more the variation of the title cards and, you know, excited to see what other interesting concepts or variations that title cards could have in future episodes. You know, Season 1 or Season 2, Season 3. Maybe they were all kind of, you know, same change in Season 1, and maybe they would be different kinds of variations in Season 2 and Season 3, although that, thinking about it, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but I don't know, I feel like that concept would be a little bit cool. That's just me. I already hate that I started doing this. I tried to get in Dan's mindset. For a character like him, who I have compared to Cartman on a couple of occasions, Cartman from South Park, you all know who I'm talking about. I know who I'm talking about. I'm a slight bit biased maybe, but I, for some reason, just keep thinking about or openly comparing him to freaking Cartman of South Park. But I started to get into Dan's mindset a little bit. There's a little bit more on this particular aspect later, but I started suggesting the idea that a vertigo-inducing inhalant that Elise had made in the episode would be used by Dan eventually to, or, you know, on the police who were sort of managing traffic, after he sort of suggested the idea to Chris. Like, I figured, ooh, maybe he'll use this inhalant on the police so that they can't really do anything about traffic, or I don't know, something like that. And I was partially right, but also not. But I was still a little bit worried about how and why in the 7th episode of this, I was already trying to get into Dan's mindset. The frickin' man-child who vows revenge on everything, and I was trying to get into his head to think about how he would plan things. In the 7th episode of the series? Seriously? Why would I do that? Why did I do that to myself? Also, call it lack of intelligence or selfishness, or maybe a combination of both in some way, but I question Dan's intelligence still when he thinks that traffic happens because he thinks that everybody else just knows when he's about to pee. It's kind of what caused the initial incident for him vowing revenge on traffic in the first place. But he actually, either he was just making a joke, or he just assumed that people just knew when he had to pee and therefore created traffic so he couldn't use the bathroom. I don't know. He also tries to put a ceiling fan, a lawnmower engine, as well as a car battery to creating a jetpack so he could avoid traffic. I didn't even realize he had the capability to think on that level, but apparently he's a little bit resourceful and has a lawnmower, even though he lives in an apartment. Unless he just stole the lawnmower, which is entirely possible. Speaking of stealing, I'm pretty sure that Dan is a little bit capable of learning, because the last time he got explosives from somewhere, in the animal shelter episode, he used Chris to buy them for him, but this time he just kind of stole them. So I guess, not in the good way, not in the best way, but I guess he is kind of capable of learning. And later on, when Dan was going to use Elise's vertigo inhalant, I think that's what it was. Since, you know, Chris had told Dan that Elise was making a vertigo inhalant, and Dan expected Chris to eventually tell Elise that he had told Dan, so that Chris and Elise would show up at his doorstep, so that Dan would go to Chris and Elise's house to steal the inhalant so he could use it. He's a lot more clever than I give him credit for, and again, apparently capable of learning, even, you know, being a freaking man-child whose brain is likely already done. Although it was probably done a long time ago, and he just stayed in that sort of teenage mindset since he vows vengeance on basically everything and anyone. And I swear, but Dan's personality really does confuse me sometimes. Like, when Chris asks if Dan suggests, you know, blowing up drivers instead of just cars, I mean, well, like, Chris didn't suggest it, but he asked if that's what Dan was suggesting. Dan was like, no. That's extreme, even though he's proven a couple times in previous episodes, namely in the animal shelter, when he is about to literally blow up an entire animal shelter full of a bunch of animals, as well as the employee who survives there. And then the New Mexico episode where he has apparently no problem with killing the cheater guy. You guys know exactly who I'm talking about. But he's been shown not to have a problem, or at least not be terribly hesitant on killing people, so why does it seem like his personality keeps taking a 180 on whether he wants to go to extreme or just not do it because it's too extreme? Like, the creators need to make up their minds. And then, apparently, Dan cares about seatbelts. He won't let Chris drive or turn on the ignition of his car without first putting on his seatbelt. So I guess he cares about that now. Dan's personality makes very little sense sometimes. And Dan's character isn't the only one who gets a little bit of, extra time and attention to. I mean, Chris certainly gets a little bit as well, but I like to think that Elise got a little bit of characterization in this particular episode. For one thing, she displayed her abilities as a potential chemist. She was able to create a vertigo-inducing inhalant in the frickin' kitchen of her own home. That takes mad skills. And before this particular episode, it had been implied a couple times that Elise had never really told Chris what it is she does for her job or anything like that, but in this particular episode, it's actually confirmed. She legitimately tells him that, I'm not going to tell you what I do for my job. I'm not going to tell you what kind of work I do. But here's the thing, too, is that Chris, being the pushover and doormat that he is, he still doesn't freaking question it. Even after Elise directly tells him that she has never told him anything about her past necessarily. I mean, except for Ninja, but that's a little bit different. But in terms of her job, she has not told him, and he still goes along with it. But there was a little bit of characterization on Dan's part, at least in my eyes, and a little bit on Elise's part, a little less so with Chris. But there are also plenty of little interesting references and parodies across the entirety of the episode. I mean, one of them being the mention of the public transportation system. I mean, Chris talked about it in pretty decent length near the beginning of the episode. I mean, I've heard good things about, transportation in non-American cities. There are plenty of big cities out in Europe and Asia that have really good public transportation, from what I've heard. I've never experienced it, but it's from what I've heard. But not so much in a bunch of the American cities. Not to say that all of them are bad, but, I can kind of see it from Dan's point of view, because he refuses to take the public bus. And I can't totally blame him, because I'm not a huge fan of buses myself. Part of it is that I'm motion sick, so buses they just give me headaches and make me a little bit nauseous especially. Being a passenger in a car is one thing, but being in a bus is a whole different thing. But again, not all public transportation systems are necessarily bad. I mean, I used to live in Lincoln, Nebraska. I think I even made mention of it during the reaction. But I used to live in Lincoln, Nebraska, and, there was a big old bus system, but Lincoln was also huge. It was spread out. It's like 260,000 people spread out over a massive area. I'm not even joking about that. But there was a very intricate bus system, especially for the university itself. There were a couple of bus routes dedicated to either a couple of stops near the campus, or there were a couple of bus routes that were dedicated entirely to transferring students from one location to another across the two campuses that were a couple of miles apart. And honestly, I actually didn't mind the bus system back then. It was actually really useful. And even by, the second part of my sophomore year of college, by the time of my junior year of college, I no longer had a parking pass for one of the parking lots of the college, and I just parked off-site and just right where a bus route kind of came. And it was really, really nice. It surprisingly wasn't all that bad. I needed to stand up at all times. I could not sit down unless I was just exhausted beyond belief. But, and that's not the only example. Like, I didn't mind the Lincoln bus system. I really didn't. It was one of the few public transportation systems I didn't mind at all. But another one I also didn't mind was the New York City subway system. I mean, that's a huge, massive underground network, and not to mention iconic. The New York subway system is, it's I can't think of the word right now, but if you've heard of New York City, you absolutely know about their subway system. It's massive and interconnected in ways that you know, nobody would believe, especially if you haven't been there. And my family lived in New York for 2 years, so we were a 2-hour train ride from the city. We lived on Long Island. But we would always take the trains and the subways into the city because it was just really nice and easy and effective. I mean, there were some maybe places and times where you didn't really want to take the subway. It wasn't the best idea, but it still wasn't the worst thing in the world. Again, not all American public transportation systems are good. Not all of them suck either. It's a little bit of a hit or miss. Personally, I think it's a little bit more of a miss in a lot of cases, but strictly my opinion. You don't have to listen to me on that. While there was some mention and reference to public transportation systems, there were also a little bit of there was also a little bit of parody in this episode, and not a thing that you would think. There was a little bit of parody to, like, spy, espionage, Bond films kind of thing, and initially I didn't see it, but after it was pointed out to me and after rewatching it, I'm like, oh wait, I kind of see it now. I mean, for one thing, Elise is working for a secret government agency thingamabob and is trying to create a non-lethal, vertigo-inducing inhalant for a secret government agency. Like, I don't know about anybody else, but that totally seems like something a secret spy service would be trying to do. They're not trying to kill anybody, they're trying to incapacitate them. Right? That seems like something that, the good guys would do. I mean, maybe the bad guys, but it kind of depends. And earlier, when I mentioned that Dan was fully expecting Chris and Elise to eventually show up at his doorstep, well, he left a VHS tape for them and decided to cryptically leave him, well, not really cryptic, now that I think about it, but he decided to leave Chris and Elise a message saying that he was basically going to steal the inhalant, and then he's got an evil laugh, so he's basically playing the role of a freaking Bond villain of all things. I can't say I'm surprised. I mean, you guys know his personality well enough at this point. Like, whether you're new to the series or you're longtime fans, you should know his personality well enough to know that he would absolutely play the role of a Bond villain. He's not freaking Bond himself. That would definitely be Elise. Definitely. Speaking of, Dan actually doesn't have a terrible evil villain laugh. Like, I don't know why, but I did find it mildly entertaining. I don't know why it was kind of good, at least in the videotape, or the first time he did it in the videotape, because I think he did it twice. The first one was definitely better than the second, but his evil laugh is surprisingly not that bad. But since he is a Bond villain, you know what that means? Bond villains lose. I've seen enough Bond movies, unfortunately. Okay, well, I don't know about unfortunately, but I've seen enough Bond films or clips of Bond films to know that the villain, he always loses. And since Dan is supposed to be portraying said Bond villain, he's going to lose. His plan is not going to work. Well, it kind of half works. He intends to sort of drop 6 canisters of vertigo inhalant over the entirety of LA, which has a massive population density, by the way. He actually tries to do it via helicopter, which, actually is not the worst idea in the world, but he tries to drop it on all of LA, and he fails. He drops 1 canister over Bakersfield, which is not terribly far from LA, so I mean, his plan kind of worked, but not in the way he intended to. Because, I mean, Bakersfield traffic is not really going to affect LA traffic that much, or at least not in Dan's respective neighborhood. So it's a little, like, the episode isn't necessarily the most exciting, but it is in its own way a little bit significant because it's the first time that Dan loses. He loses. He cannot get revenge on whatever he wanted to get revenge on. He can't. I guess I expected it that if he wasn't able to get revenge on something, that it would be for a bit more of a significant reason, but I guess he just can't get revenge on traffic. You can never get revenge on traffic, of all things. There will always be traffic, there will always be drivers, good and bad, clogging up the roads, especially during rush hour, which, Dan, if you haven't heard of the concept of rush hour, you probably should have. Everybody doesn't know when you're gonna pee. That's not how that works. It's called rush hour. You were the one who probably just left and decided to drive at the wrong freaking time. Heck, even I know about rush hour, and I don't really live in a very busy city, but I know enough about some of the other cities that I have lived in that either I know the perfect times to leave and go home, but I also know the back roads too. That's how you avoid traffic, my friend. You gotta be smart about it, but clearly Dan isn't, or maybe he is. I don't know. His intelligence is, again, a hit or miss. you never know what he's gonna know and what he's not gonna know. But clearly, it's a miss on knowing about the rush hour traffic, obviously. And there are a couple of other little miscellaneous things that were seen/mentioned in the episode. Like, first, we finally see Chris at a job. He actually has a job. He's never been, I mean, it's never been confirmed, like, you know, what job he had or something like that. He apparently has a boring sales office job or something like that. But I don't know. But we finally get confirmation that he has a job, so I mean, at least he's not unemployed. I mean, for now. He did take a personal call at work. One of his coworkers said as much, so maybe that got him fired. And we see a recurring character, that hippie, I think his name is Crunchy, who was a cashier at Wally's Explosives. He was first seen in the animal shelter because, you know, he worked at the animal shelter. And it wasn't significant because I'd already known that recurring characters were a thing with the Wolfman guy, whoever he was, who actually, funny enough, worked at the Explosive Emporium, now that I think about it. But it was significant in knowing that this hippie, Crunchy, would be a recurring character. It was less interesting knowing that there would be recurring characters because I already knew, and more interesting that it was Crunchy of all characters who was going to be recurring. Didn't realize he was going to be seen again, but apparently he's been seen again. So there is that. But that is all for this particular review, so thank you all for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the reaction and the review. Again, reaction is linked down in the description below, but luckily I said at the beginning of the episode, so you guys already know that. So thank you all for watching, and as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.